Okay, so we're going to go through the notes or the lesson notes for sexual and asexual reproduction. First, you're going to start by figuring out where you stand as far as your understanding level for this topic. So we're going to read through the essential questions, and then you're going to decide how well you know the answers to these already. The first one says, how are sexual and asexual reproduction comparable? Number 2, what types of reproduction produces uniform and diverse offspring? And number 3, how is genetic information passed from parents to offspring? So what you'll do for each of these questions is to think about on the left there, it says number 1, if you were quizzed today, which questions would you know the answers to already? You're going to click and drag the green check mark next to the ones that you really know well. And number 2 says, which questions would you need to learn more about to answer confidently? You would click and drag a question mark and put it next to those that you think you need to learn some more information about. Okay, so the cell is the smallest structural, functional, and biological unit of all living organisms. It's often called the building block of life. And it has a nucleus inside, which is the organelle present in most eukaryotic cells that contains genetic material. So the question here, it says, what is significant about the cell in regards to reproduction? Well, the cell contains the genetic information that's needed for everything inside an organism. So this picture is showing us kind of the breakdown of the genetic material in a cell. This first term, chromosomes, are thread-like molecules that carry hereditary information. They're made of proteins and one molecule of DNA. So one big long strand of DNA wrapped around this protein forms a chromosome. And most of them are arranged in pairs within the nucleus of the cell. Sometimes they look like X's because they're kind of wound up and condensed and in nice tight packages. But many times it looks like just it's all unwound and stringy looking too. So that's why they use the term thread-like molecule, because it's kind of stringy looking. And then we have X and Y chromosomes. Each person has a pair of sex chromosomes in each cell. Females will have 2 X chromosomes. Males have an X and a Y. And the Y chromosome contains a gene that triggers embryonic development to become a male. So our question on the right, what do XY chromosomes determine in an organism? Well, they determine the gender development of an organism, whether it becomes a male or female. Then we have DNA, which is also found inside the nucleus, and that's what makes up our chromosome. The long name for it is deoxyribonucleic acid, but we use the abbreviation DNA, and it contains the instructions that an organism needs to develop, live, and reproduce. It's found inside every cell, and it's passed down from parents to children, or the offspring. And then a gene. This is the basic physical and functional unit of heredity. It's made up of DNA, and then the DNA makes up chromosomes, remember. Each person has 2 copies of each gene because you got one from each parent. All right, so now you're going to click and drag to organize your terms and your definitions. So the first picture at the top there is pointing to, the arrow's pointing to the nucleus, and which is the purple thing inside the cell. The nucleus contains the genetic material for the cell. And then if we go clockwise over to the right, the next picture is showing us a chromosome. That's what that X-shaped structure is. And if we go back a few slides, we can find the definition of a chromosome is the thread-like molecule found in the nucleus that contains DNA. And then the DNA is going to contain instructions that an organism needs to develop and live. And then a gene at the bottom left there is made up of DNA and is the basic physical unit of heredity. So if you were asked a question, what are like the levels of organization from biggest to smallest in a cell, you would go in the clockwise order, starting with nucleus, then chromosome, then DNA, then gene. Okay, so let's get into asexual reproduction. This is the type of reproduction where you get offspring just from one parent. And it's through the process of mitosis. And if you think about the word mitosis, it has a T in there, so then you're going to get two cells at the end. Offspring are going to inherit the genes of only the one parent, and the offspring are going to be genetically identical or uniform. Uniform means the same. They're going to be identical to the parent. So the question on the right, how many parents are there in asexual reproduction? Well, what we read in that first bullet, there's only one parent. Okay, so mitosis is one type of cell division, and this is for the organisms that use asexual reproduction. They're going to use mitosis. It results in two daughter cells having the same number and kind of chromosomes as the parent cell, and the cell goes through different phases before they become the clone of the parent or identical to the parent. So what is the result of a cell that undergoes division by mitosis? Well, mitosis results in two genetically identical cells. Binary fission is one type of asexual reproduction. It's very common in prokaryotes like bacteria, and these are the organisms with no nucleus. It can occur in some single-celled eukaryotes that have a nucleus. Fully grown parent will just basically split into two halves, producing two new cells. And the examples are going to be bacteria, amoeba, euglena. These are all very small single-celled organisms that can do this. The next type of asexual reproduction is called budding. Offspring basically grows out of the body of the parent. It buds off. And this example here is showing a little hydra. Hydra are kind of relative to jellyfish. So they can reproduce sexually, but this is the one way that they can reproduce asexually. On the right, it says hydra reproduce asexually by budding. How does the offspring compare genetically to the parent? The genes of the hydra offspring are going to be genetically identical to the parent. And then we have fragmentation. This is when the body of the parent breaks into distinct pieces, and each piece can produce an offspring. Tissue regrowth due to regeneration can occur. And the example that we see here are planarians in that top picture and sea stars in the bottom. So essentially, you can have several different little pieces from the adult, and you can grow a full new organism from that. Regeneration is very similar to fragmentation, but this is just when one piece of the parent is detached and can grow into a completely new organism. So sea stars, again, can use this, and some sea cucumbers, which are interesting little animals. Then we have vegetative reproduction or vegetative propagation, sometimes it's said. It's a process where new organisms arise without the production of seeds or spores. And some examples are like strawberry plants, potatoes. They kind of grow an offshoot from the main parent plant, and then you can see a new plant growing from it. All right, so here we have our matching, and you're using the vocabulary that we just learned about asexual reproduction. So you can always go back to the slides to see, how each one is defined. But I'll go through the list for you. So budding is when an offspring grows out of the body of an organism. Fragmentation is the body of the parent that breaks into a distinct piece, and each piece can produce a new organism. The vegetative reproduction is when a new organism arises without a spore or a seed. Binary fission is when a fully grown parent cell splits into two halves and produces two new cells. And then regeneration is when a piece of a parent is detached. It can grow into a completely new offspring. All right, so this is for you to think about a little bit. If you find an offspring that is not genetically identical to its parent organism, what type of reproduction created it? Well, if it's not the same, and what we've been talking about so far is asexual reproduction, where you have genetically identical organisms. So this question is saying if it's not genetically identical, then it's got to be sexual reproduction, right? All right, so some advantages of asexual reproduction. It's going to be good for organisms that are not mobile. That means they can't move around and go look for a mate, like plants. Numerous offspring can be created without costing the parent a lot of energy, and it's pretty quick. The disadvantage is that it lacks genetic variation. Everybody's the same, so there's no variety. And that's a problem because then all of the organisms are going to share the same weakness. And then if the environment changes, there might not be enough time for that population to adapt quickly enough to survive. There won't be any variations that are going to be survivable in that new condition. So what does the statement lacks genetic variation mean? And why would this be a disadvantage? Well, lacks genetic variation means that the organisms share the same weakness, they're all the same, and this is a disadvantage because the same negative trait can be passed on to offspring. All right, so here's another click and drag. You're going to slide the cards for advantages and disadvantages for asexual reproduction. So the ones you should have for advantage is good for organisms that are not mobile and cannot look for a mate, numerous offspring without costing the parent a great amount of energy, and that it's quick. And then disadvantages, you should have lax genetic variation because all organisms are the same, they share the same weakness. And if the environment changes, there may not be time to adapt quickly enough to survive. All right, so here's another think about it question. This is about a population of organisms that reproduces asexually. Which would be more difficult for the population to survive? A disease that destroys half the population or a disease that targets any organism in the population with similar traits, and why? So it's going to be the one that destroys organisms with similar traits. And so it's because with asexual reproduction, there only needs to be one parent. So even if half the population is gone, it's okay because they can easily make more. They don't need to find mates. But if a disease targets a specific trait and they all have that specific trait, then the whole population may not survive. Okay, sexual reproduction. This is the type of reproduction where offspring need two parents. One parent produces male gametes or sperm, and the other parent will produce female gametes or ova or ovum. Ovum is singular, ova is plural for egg. And then gametes are egg cell or are sex cells in general. They could be egg or sperm, and they're formed through a process of cell division called meiosis. Meiosis is a type of cell division that reduces the number of chromosomes in the parent cell by half and produces 4 genetically different gamete cells. It goes through many phases. So there's 2 sets of divisions. If you take a look at the diagram, you can see it divides once into 2 cells and then divides again, and you end up with 4 cells. And this is required to produce egg and sperm cells for sexual reproduction. So the question on the right says, what is the result of a cell that undergoes division by meiosis? You're going to result in 4 genetically different gamete cells that have half the DNA of the original cell. Okay, now we're going to compare mitosis with meiosis, looking at them side by side. How about we look at the picture first, because you have some numbers in here that I want you to understand. There's the term, you can see 2n, 4n, and then on the bottom right, you see n. N is kind of like that mystery number, like in math where you have to solve for x. So n in this case is the number of chromosomes, okay? Or yeah. So like for a human, for example, n would be 23 in this case. So 2n, 2 times 23, that's 46 chromosomes. So you can see both mitosis and meiosis start with a 2n number, and that's called a diploid number. The term diploid means, or di means 2. So we're starting with 2 sets of chromosomes, 2 sets of 23. Both processes, you have to have the DNA get replicated so that the new cells are going to have their own copy of DNA, and it'll be identical to the original one. So they both have to go through replication, so you end up with 4n. So it's going to be 4 times 23. But then mitosis divides, and you end up with 2n again, and that's how come you can have identical cells, is because you start out with 46, double it to 92, and then it divides in half to 46 again, and then you have the normal number. In meiosis, you start out with 46, you double it to 92, and then it divides in half to 46 again, but then it divides again, and now you end up with 23 chromosomes. That's what just n means. It's like a 1n. You only have one set of chromosomes, so there's 23 in each of those 4 cells. So if we go look at the bullets on the left, mitosis produces 2 diploid cells. That's what the 2N means, okay, that they're diploid. And they're going to be identical to the parents or uniform. Meiosis produces 4 haploid cells. Haploid sounds like half, and so we're getting half the DNA that we started out with. And this is going to contain some characteristics of the parent cell, but they're not going to be identical to each other. And this means that they are diverse, that they're different. All right, so here's our Venn diagram kind of working with what we just went through with mitosis and meiosis. So mitosis is going to produce cells that are uniform or all the same, and it's going to produce 2 identical cells. Meiosis will create cells that are diverse or different, and it'll produce 4 cells that are not identical. And reproduction of cells goes in the middle because both of them are a form of cell reproduction or cell division. All right, so a little more on sexual reproduction. A sperm is going to enter an ova during fertilization. And you can see in the diagram here, the sperm is quite small. Really, all it's doing is delivering its DNA, and then the DNA from the egg and the sperm can match up, and you end up with something called a zygote. And that's what fertilization is. So in humans, each gamete contains 23 chromosomes, and the 2 are going to fuse to form a zygote with 23 pairs, or a total of 46. And the organism's appearance could vary due to the new combinations of genes that it has. So the zygote then divides by mitosis after the fertilization has happened, and it passes through several different developmental phases into a big multicellular individual. The offspring are going to be genetically different or not identical to their parents. If you look at the picture, you can see there goes through the zygote, which is the fertilized egg, and then it goes through a process called cleavage, which just means a type of cell division, where the cells just divide and divide and divide. And then after a while, it starts to form specialized cells. But here, this is just showing the very early stages of cell division after fertilization. Now, the question we have here, how does the offspring compare to the parents in sexual reproduction? Well, in sexual reproduction, the offspring are going to be genetically different from the parents. Okay, so we're going to review. We're going to move the orange boxes around so that the list illustrates the correct steps, showing the development of an organism through sexual reproduction. I apologize, the instructions here talk about hormones, and I think this was copied from a different unit, so I'll have to make sure that that gets corrected. So the correct steps are listed here. So step 1, through meiosis, the testes produces sperm and the ovaries produce ova. Number 2, the sperm moves toward the ova. Number 3, it fertilizes the ova. So the sperm and ova fuse to form a zygote. And then the zygote divides by mitosis. And then finally, the offspring is fully developed. Some advantages of sexual reproduction: it leads to genetic variation in generations. It's fundamental for environmental adaptation, because if there's no variety and the environment changes, then none of the organisms may be ready to survive. The organisms are going to be more protected because it doesn't necessarily inherit the weakness from the parent. And it will remove bad genes from the population many times. So genetic variation is an advantage because it removes bad genes from the population. So that's how you would answer the question on the right. Some disadvantages. The problem is the organism has to find a mate. It takes time and energy to do that. And it also takes longer for reproduction to occur. So it takes a while to produce the cells that are going to be used for reproduction. And then for the development of the offspring, it takes time as well. Usually in many organisms, there's even parent care involved. So that takes even more time and energy. Another disadvantage is that it can prevent favorable genes from being passed down. Remember, in sexual reproduction, you're only getting half the DNA from the parents. So you could be getting the good gene, or you could be getting a bad gene. So that's, a 50-50 chance there. And this is also going to produce fewer offspring, which ideally a species wants to produce as many offspring as possible to keep continuing that species. So this this process is going to produce fewer offspring. Okay, so now you have to click and drag your cards to match the advantages and disadvantages of sexual reproduction. One advantage is that organisms are going to be more protected. It doesn't necessarily have the weakness of the parent. It's going to remove bad genes from the population, and it can lead to genetic variations in the new generation, which is fundamental for environmental adaptation. The disadvantages of sexual reproduction: organisms have to find a mate that increases the time for reproduction. It's going to produce fewer offspring, and it can sometimes prevent favorable genes from being passed down. Okay, so now we're going to think about the same situation as earlier, but now we're looking at a population of organisms that reproduces sexually. Which would be more difficult for that population to survive? A disease that destroys half of its population, or a disease that targets any organism in the population with similar traits, and why? So this time we're going to go with half the population. And the reason is that it's going to eliminate mate opportunities, so there won't be as many mates available to find. Okay, and then there are some of these organisms that can reproduce using both processes. Depending on the environment, it can switch between sexual and asexual reproduction. There are some benefits to this. You might think, what could be some benefits? Well, kind of depends on the situation. If there's no mates available, then it's great that it can reproduce asexually. Some plant examples, except for funguses aren't plants, but I guess it doesn't go in the animal category either. So funguses, strawberries, daffodils, and then some animals like the starlit sea anemone, jellyfish, and sponges. They all have the ability to reproduce both ways. And there's a lot more examples, but these are just a few. Okay, so now we're going to do a little sneak peek preview of mutations, of the genetics topic. And the reason is because with sexual reproduction, actually with either type of reproduction, there's always a chance for mutations. And that's where variety plays a role. And that's kind of a good thing when you think about evolution. So a definition of a mutation is just simply a change in DNA. It doesn't have to be a good change, and it doesn't have to be a bad change, but it's just simply a change in the DNA. And you can see that on the right. That's like one strip of DNA or one half of a strand of DNA. And you can see where that letter T is. That's representing one of the nucleotides. It changes into a C. So when that part of the DNA changes, we call it a mutation. It could create something good. It could improve, it's the organism's ability to survive, or it could harm it, or it may have no effect whatsoever. So a mutation can cause changes in an organism, can change its appearance, how it behaves, how it functions. But these mutations are essential to evolution. They're the raw material of genetic variation. And the organisms that develop mutations that are going to help them survive better tend to pass those beneficial mutations on to their offspring. There are harmful mutations, and like I said, we'll get into this more when we talk about genetics. But sickle cell anemia is a blood disorder with humans. Cystic fibrosis, there's albinism, which is when you see there's no pigment in the skin, hair, or fur of an organism. Down syndrome, wingless fruit flies, hemophilia, that's another blood disorder, dwarfism. So these are all going to contain a harmful mutation in the DNA that can in some situations have a really detrimental effect. So here's another example of why there's not a lot of harmful mutations in the population. So this is showing us how you get sickle cell. And if you look at the person in red, they've inherited 2 copies of the bad gene. And that's many times how it works with some of these mutations, is that you have to get 2 copies of it in order to have that disorder. So you're not going to see a lot of the population with some of these disorders, but you can see the chances of it occurring is about 25%. Okay, so now we're going to do the card sort and put these statements under either sexual reproduction or asexual reproduction. So under asexual, you should have the type of reproduction by which organisms or offspring arise from a single organism. And then you should have offspring inherit the genes of only one parent. The offspring is genetically identical to the parent. and they're produced by mitosis. Under sexual reproduction, you should have the type of reproduction by which offspring arise from two parents. The offspring is more diverse and has a mixture of DNA from both parents, and gametes are formed by meiosis. All right, so with our check for understanding, I want you to answer these before you look at the answers. So the first one says, determine the similarities and differences between asexual and sexual reproduction. So maybe a similarity is that both types can undergo cell division. Differences would be with asexual reproduction, there's one parent and they're genetically identical offspring. With sexual reproduction, there's two parents and you get genetically diverse offspring. Number two, you're going to identify the type of offspring. Is it uniform or diverse from both kinds of reproduction? So sexual reproduction results in offspring that are genetically diverse because you have a combination of both parents. And then asexual reproduction results in offspring that are genetically identical. They're like little clones of the parent. Number three, you're going to write down some advantages and disadvantages of both types of reproduction. So for sexual reproduction, the ability to adapt to a changing environment is an advantage. A disadvantage would be that it takes longer and you get fewer offspring. For asexual reproduction, an advantage is that it's fast and that it does not need to find a mate. And then disadvantages, major one is that there's no genetic diversity. Okay, and on the last slide, you're going to go back to that beginning part where we had our essential questions. And you're going to read through them again and see, do you feel more comfortable with them? Are there any that you would still need more help to understand, or do you understand them pretty well? And that's the end of our asexual and sexual reproduction lesson.